Aloha, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual seminar brought to you by the Hawaii Statewide Family Engagement Center. We are just excited to have our wonderful speakers and have all of you join us today for our Maui Symposium, Engagement for Student Success, Collaborating for our Keiki. At this moment, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful and lovely Dr. Tuan Chin, our director.
Thank you, Ange. Good morning. On behalf of the Hawaii Statewide Family Engagement Center, I welcome each and every one of you to our virtual symposium, Ohana Engagement for Student Success, Collaborating for Keiki. My name is Tuan Chin, and I'm the project director of the Hawaii Statewide Family Engagement Center. Our project is funded by a 5-year US DOE grant awarded to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, with the objective of strengthening family engagement in education. Our mission is to promote high-impact activities and policies that build powerful partnership among family, school, and community in order to enhance child development and student achievement. To that end, Hawaii Statewide Family Engagement Center supports schools, educators, and families through training, technical assistance, and resource development specific to the needs of our uniquely diverse island community. In the past 3 years, we have provided intense family engagement in education training to cohort schools in Kauai and Hawaii counties. We will be working with Maui in year 4 and 5, and with Oahu in year 5. We have partnered with community organizations to provide family-friendly financial literacy training, Micronesian parent engagement training, and parent advocacy training. We continue to support high-impact strategies and practices that lead to improved student achievement. We also share resources through our website, webinar, newsletter, and social media. So later on, we will have an opportunity to share our resources with all of you. Next slide. Next, I just want to take the opportunity to do some housekeeping. There's some FAQs. So this webinar is being recorded. Next week, everyone who registered will receive an email with the slides and a link to the recording. The recording will be made available for 2 weeks until October 11, 2021. To view the chat box, press the chat icon that looks like a word bubble at the bottom, at the left bottom of the black toolbar. Please chat your questions to Q&A in the chat box privately, and the HVAC team will ask those questions to the presenters for you during the Q&A sections. To talk, click the unmute icon on the left bottom black toolbar. If you are joining us by phone, dial *6 to mute or unmute. Next slide. Okay, here's a look at today's agenda. We've got a very special keynote and guest speakers who are looking forward to share their knowledge and ideas with you today. Okay, now let's see who's with us today. Please, Lisa, can you start the poll?
Thanks, Tuan. So folks, just to get an idea of who's here with us today, please take a moment to answer these 2 questions. Ooh, I see them rolling in. Very good. I see a lot of administrators, teachers, and educators with us today. Ooh, wonderful to have families and community-based organizations. We've got about a tie so far for who's attending from which island. But I'll give you about 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to end the poll. Alrighty, mahalo. So let's see who's with us today. We've got a lot of administrators, educators, and teachers, family members, CBOs, and a lot of people from Big Island and Oahu. Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you, mahalo for joining us, everyone. I see a lot of familiar names in our participant list. So it's good to see you guys. I hope you enjoyed today. Chuan?
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, the leading expert in family engagement, Dr. Karen Mapp. Dr. Karen Mapp is a senior lecturer on education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the faculty director of the Education Policy and Management Master's Program. Over the past 20 years, Dr. Mapp's research and practice focus has been on the cultivation of partnerships among family community members and educators that support student achievement and school improvement. From 2011 to 2013, Dr. Mapp served as a consultant on family and community engagement to the United States Department of Education in the Office of Innovation and Improvement. The Dual Capacity Building Framework was authored by Dr. Karen Mapp with the help and support of USDOE during her consultancy with the department. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Karen Mapp.
Thank you so much for having me today. You should know that the original intention was that I would actually be in Maui right now doing this, even though it would have been remote. My husband and I were supposed to be in Maui for a month, the whole month of September, on vacation and relaxation, but more because my husband fell about 2 months ago and had to have surgery on his knee. That's the main reason we're not there. I know that COVID may have also played a part in us not being there, but that's the main reason we're not there. So I'm feeling a little melancholy today. This is bittersweet because I would rather be really with you on the island, but hopefully next year that we'll be able to come back to Maui. I love Maui, I love Hawaii, and I miss the islands very, very, very much. So we're going to spend some time today, hopefully sharing information with you. My colleague and friend Steve Sheldon is also with you today, so this is a real treat. And between the two of us, hopefully we are going to be able to share with you what we've learned in our careers around what effective partnerships with families look like, and then some of the things that you might want to include in your own practice to make those partnerships with families even more effective and even more enjoyable. So I'm going to share my screen, okay? And why don't you all give me a thumbs up so I know you can see that? Okay, perfect, wonderful. And so this talk is called Now More Than Ever, Family Engagement is Essential for Student School Success, because the pandemic has really punctuated the need for strong partnerships between home and school. And for those of you who had a chance to read the Carnegie Report, and it's not something that you could read quickly. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I suggest you could do it later on. Sit down with it, because I think it makes us think about our own practice pretty seriously. So I highly recommend it, because I think it also has some really good recommendations in it. But in that report, which I wrote with one of my doctoral students, he's now graduated, Ayel Bergman, he now is working for Learning Heroes. We said in the beginning of the report that the two pandemics, so not only the global COVID crisis, but also the crisis of systemic racism that really came to the forefront for a lot of us this past year. Both of those are actually forcing a rethinking, a real reimagining, a recalibration of the family school partnership. So I've had a number of practitioners starting in March of 2020 who called me, emailed me, and asked me, Dr. Mapp, what are we going to do now? How are we going to do family engagement now? And I have to be honest with you, many of those districts or schools or states who had been really avoiding doing better around family engagement, or who were still recalcitrant around this whole, why does family engagement make a difference? All of a sudden, They were calling because you could not do education without families. All education that was happening over the course of the past almost 2 years, families had to be included. They had to be engaged. We had to have conversations with them. So I think that the pandemics have been what we call sort of a forcing function, and it really pushed those who might have been hesitant about thinking about ways to engage families. It's brought them all to the table. So there's been several studies now looking at, how are our practitioners, how are educators really thinking about family engagement? And so this is a report that was done by the Brookings Institute recently by Rebecca Winthrop, where basically they're saying, in the month of March 2020, pretty much all the schools around the world closed. I mean, let that sink in for a minute. All the schools around the world closed. And so consequently, engaging families had to move to the top of the agenda. And people started to try to find very new, and I would actually say not so new, that they actually started using a lot of the things that Joyce Epstein and I and Steve Sheldon have been talking about for decades. They finally were ready to embrace some of those strategies. So here's what I'm going to do today. We're going to talk about what do we really mean by family engagement? What are the definitions that maybe this new normal have brought to our attention? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we know from the research about why engaging families is important. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this new normal, this language that we're now using about family engagement and the conditions that have to be set in order for this new type of engagement to occur successfully. So let's start out with the definition. So this is a definition that I started using a couple of years back. And the reason why I really like this definition is because it was actually designed for, by, and with families. So the State Department of Education in Connecticut had a whole, they did a whole process, a co-design process, where they worked with families across the state of Connecticut to come up with this definition. So they worked on teams, and no, it didn't happen overnight. And that's one thing that we have to realize, is that sometimes this does make it so that we go a little slower, but it means that there's more buy-in, there's more ownership. And so this is a definition that the families and practitioners and policymakers came up with together, that family engagement is a full, equal, and equitable partnership among families, educators, and community partners to promote children's learning and development from birth through college and career. Full, we mean that families are engaged on all levels, many dimensions. They're not just being asked to show up for open houses or for that 1 or 2 parent-teacher conferences. Families are really engaged in things like, in some cases, professional development. We have schools now and districts that are working with families, and families are a part of professional development for educators, both as learners and as teachers. They are a part of lots of decision-making conversations. So this is what they mean by a full partnership. Equal meaning that we see our families as equal partners, that we're pulling away the hierarchies, that we're not creating these false ladders where families are on the bottom and the educators with the degrees are at the top of the ladder. No, we've made it so that everybody is valuable. Everybody has funds of knowledge that we know are important in order for us to create the best environment and the best learning for our kids. And then finally, the partnership is equitable, meaning that we may have to go the extra mile. We may have to meet families where they are at in order for these partnerships to be effective. So for example, I'll give you an example of a wonderful story I heard in Iowa, in Marshalltown, where the educators were noticing more and more that there were quite a few students who were coming up from Mexico. Their families were working on some of the soybean farms there. And at times in the winter, the students would leave school for almost a month to go back and to be with their families in Mexico. So instead of having a deficit-based opinion about that, the educators decided, we're going to go to Mexico and talk to the teachers and educators there and the families and see what we can do to create a system so there isn't learning loss while the kids are away. And they ended up forming this wonderful partnership with the educators from the towns where the families were coming from so that they could share information with the educators there so the kids were always on target with their learning. So this is what I mean about, equitable. That's a big scale example, but even in terms of recognizing the different languages our families may be using at home and making sure that we provide translation or we provide all the materials and the languages that are used at home. These are the kinds of things that we need to do to make sure that our partnerships are equitable. So one of the things that you may notice, and I'm hoping that this is going to become routine, and I think it is, more and more you're hearing people say or write family engagement instead of parent or family involvement. And I think we've come a long way. And in the legislation now that you see coming out of the Department of Ed in Washington, you'll see that it says family and parent engagement. We say family because we want to make sure people know that we are talking about all adult caretakers, not just mom, dad, but grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle. And we say engagement rather than involvement for reasons that I think Larry Filazzo, who's an educator and has been for decades, I think he really nicely says this about the difference between involvement and engagement. So he says a school striving for family involvement often leads with its mouth, right? It's pretty much telling families what to do, what they need to do. So it identifies the projects, needs and goals, and then tells parents how they can contribute. Families aren't usually involved in identifying those projects, needs and goals. The schools, the educators, we know better. We're going to tell families what we think and we want them to follow suit. But a school striving for family or parent engagement, on the other hand, tends to lead with its ears, right? So it's listening to what parents think, dream, and worry about. It's listening to what families have to say. It's listening to what families know about their child, and that knowledge make us better educators. So the goal of family engagement is not to serve clients, but to gain partners. And, I have changed in my own practice because when I was deputy superintendent for family and community engagement in Boston back in 2003, I actually used to use this client language. And the way I was thinking was that I used to tell my staff, listen, I want you to treat our families the way Nordstrom treats its clients. And I don't know how many of you ever shopped at a Nordstrom's. I haven't been there in a while, but they're known for customer service, treating people really well. And so I wanted my staff to treat parents with that kind of respect. But then a parent said to me one time, Dr. Mapp, we don't want to be clients. That's not who we are, because clients are still people who are sort of at the margins. It's not that we want to be served. We want to be a part of the team. And that's when I really learned that the client language, although well-intentioned, was not correct. Really what our families want to be and what we should see them as our partners in this educational endeavor. So now what have we learned about the impact of this type of engagement? And so there's been we're close to now 50 years of research on the impact of family engagement on a number of things. We used to mainly focus our studies on the impact on students. And right now, Ann Henderson and I have been writing buddies for a long time. She and I wrote Beyond the Bake Sale. Some of you may be familiar with that book. We wrote something called A New Wave of Evidence back in 2002, where we featured studies that mainly focused on the impact of these partnerships on students. But now, because of the wonderful research of people like Dr. Sheldon, we've now have studies that are looking at, what's the effect of these partnerships on families? What's the effect of these partnerships on you, those of you who are educators in the audience? And then what's the effect of partnerships on our institutions like our schools? So I'm going to quickly run through some of this research, because I think sometimes we need that evidence when we're talking to colleagues. We obviously need it when we're writing grant proposals, because they want to see evidence-based practices and strategies. But sometimes we needed to talk to our colleagues who still might be a little hesitant, who may be saying, I've got a lot on my plate already. Why are you now asking me to do this? I'm already overtaxed, overworked. What we now know from the research actually is that family engagement partnerships actually make the job of educators a lot easier. And you're going to actually hear a little later in a video, I'm going to show an educator saying that very thing. So let's talk about the impact on our students. So these are the outcomes that we see when we engage our families in partnership around education. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I want you to take a look at them. So, of course, what we're looking for, we want our kids to earn higher grades and test scores, but look at all the other impacts engaging with our families has on the students. These are actually students who end up engaging in higher level programs. So those AP and honors courses, or if you have an international baccalaureate program. One of the other things we see is that attendance is affected by our partnerships with families. So one of the first things and one of the easier things to track is attendance. And I think that I heard that Hawaii is entering into a partnership with Everyday Labs with my friend and colleague, Todd Rogers, who really helps looking at the rise in attendance when we engage families. These are the kids that graduate and go on to higher education. I think one of the main things that really sticks out for teachers in particular is that the attitude of their students towards school changes. When that student knows that grandma or grandpa or auntie or uncle or a sibling, or those people we even call fictive kin, those are the aunties and uncles and cousins that are sort of, we don't quite know how they're related to us, or the play aunties and uncles. But when those children know that a parent in that way, a family member in that way, and they see that bond between home and school, it changes their attitude about school. I'll never forget one young man in ninth grade told me that, he was reacting to teachers coming to his home during a home visit program, and he saw the real camaraderie and his parents. And he said that he felt seen. He felt seen because those educators knew his family in a way that was personal and respectful. And so it changed his way of thinking about school. So these are some of the outcomes that we see for our students. But here's some of the things we now know about what happens to our families as a result of these partnerships between home and school. And some of this is the work of Kathy Hoover Dempsey, where she identified how and why, what were some of the elements of how and why families are involved in their children's education. And one of the things that we've seen is that when families engage with you in these effective and respectful partnerships, they start to change the way they think they can have impact on their child's learning. So in layman's terms, she talks about their perception of their job description, how they can and should be engaged in their children's education changes. The technical term that she uses is called their role construction, but it's really how they see themselves as effective partners in their kids' education. They start to gain more confidence in their ability to shape and influence their children's learning. Their efficacy strengthens. And they start to change the way that they're in relationship with the children's classroom and the children's school. They start to say, maybe I want to advocate for all kids. I'm not just about my child, and maybe I'll join a committee, or maybe I'll help to work on some of the things that are happening at the school. Maybe I'll join that school site council or that PTA. And then finally, sometimes it actually has an impact on families being empowered to take on new challenges, like going back to school themselves, or maybe getting that one big job, is what my families used to say to me, going for 2 or 3 jobs by getting an education to one job. So these are all the things that we see that actually happen to our families because of these partnerships. How about the educators? Well, we are learning that our teachers, our principals, our other staff, our school counselors, everyone, office staff, everyone in the building, they really like a building that has a strong culture of family engagement. When the school itself makes family partnership a part of its DNA, people don't leave those schools. They like the fact that they have partners. Let's face it, being an educator can sometimes be a very isolating experience where you feel you're alone, you're at this alone Sunday night, you're putting together, your packets for the next day. It can feel very lonely, but when you have those family members as your partners, one of my teachers that I interviewed a couple of years ago told me that the families are the wind beneath her wings. They're why she comes to work every day, because she knows she's not alone in trying to teach the children. She was a high school teacher. And then finally, we actually know more about the impact that these partnerships have on the ability of schools to improve. So this is a book called Organizing Schools for Improvement, Lessons from Chicago, and it came out in 2010. But this research has resonated with a lot of people. I constantly hear this research being brought up in terms of helping us to identify what makes for a successful school. What ingredients have to be in place for a school to be successful? And what these researchers found out was there's something called 5 essential supports. Now, I don't know how many of you watch the Great British Baking Show, but that is one of my favorite shows. And I watch it all the time. And I've learned a lot of new things about what ingredients make a huge difference in the success of a cake or a pie or bread. So these researchers found out that there are 5 main ingredients that have to be in that recipe of a successful school. What are the 5 ingredients? The first is leadership. The school leader makes a huge difference. And we could go into a whole other training on what makes for a successful school leader. But one of the things we know is it's the person who's not afraid to share power, who's not afraid to build leadership among everyone in the building, teachers, others, students, and families. You have to have strong professional capacity in the building, meaning that everybody in the building wants to be there, wants to learn, and wants to be a learning community. You have to have a student-centered learning climate versus an adult-centered learning climate. And I can tell you right now, when I was deputy superintendent in Boston and would visit schools, it didn't take long, usually only about 10 minutes, to tell the difference between a building that had a student-centered culture versus an adult-centered culture. People in the student-centered culture were always asking about, is that the best practice for our children? Is that the best way to go about learning? Versus places that say, well, what about us? We want to do what's easiest for the adults. Those places usually were not successful schools. What else do we see? Instructional guidance. So this is where we have really strong professional development and really strong infrastructure support for the school. And then also we have the last piece, the last ingredient, really, really important. Parent and community ties, engaged families. Now think about that for a moment. These researchers have identified family school community partnerships as a main ingredient of the recipe of a successful school. So that purple rectangle you see over in the corner is what happens in the classroom. It's the relationship between the student, the teacher, and the content. It's called the instructional core. All 5 of these ingredients have a tremendous impact on what happens in that classroom. And so one of the questions I want you to sit with today is, does our building, does our school, do I see family engagement as a key ingredient to the success of our school, a key ingredient to student success? A lot of places, let's be honest, a lot of places don't see family engagement as being that important. They see it as an add-on. They see it as something that's nice to do when we have time. And you know what happens then? It slides off the table. So one of the things I want you to think about is, do we see family engagement as a main essential support of our school in terms of its improvement, or do we see it as an add-on? And if we see it as an add-on, that has to change. Because what these researchers found is that if you take out any one of these ingredients, including the family engagement ingredient, your school and your students will not improve. So this was a big deal when this came out in the research community. It was a really big deal for us in the family engagement community because we finally had proof of how important family engagement actually is. Okay. I'm going to just pause for a second, Schwan and Lisa, because I know I've been talking a lot. I just want to pause for a second to see if there's any questions about what I've just said.
Yes, there actually is a question. The question is, can you please give us an example of leading with the ear? How would that look like?
Well, I'm going to do that in as I continue, but let me give you a quick example of that. So a lot of times when we make phone calls home to families, particularly in the beginning of the school year, we're talking at them. So a lot of times we'll call them and let them know sort of, hi, my name is Karen and I'm your child's 9th grade teacher. Let me tell you what the expectations are for materials. I'm going to be sending you a list of the activities we're going to have. And do you have any questions? All right. The phone call is not about, hi, I'm Karen. I'm your student's 9th grade teacher. And what I'd love to know from you, or maybe I teach English, what I'd love to know from you is, I'd like to get to know you better. How are you doing? And I know this has been a hard time for all of us. This COVID is driving us crazy. How's your family? My family, we did pretty well. And I really would love to let you know that you are your child's first teacher. And if this isn't a good time, I'll call you back at another time, but I'd love for you to tell me, what are some of the strengths and challenges that you've seen in your child over this past year? What are some of the things I should know about your child? What are some of the things that they like? You see what I'm saying? We're asking them questions and we're listening and gaining their knowledge versus the other way around. A lot of times we don't take a breath. We don't listen to our families. Our families have so much knowledge about their children. And if we only set aside some time to listen to them instead of talking at them, we would get so much information that we could use in our classrooms. I could tell you numerous stories about when teachers and educators finally listened to families. They heard things that really, really helped them in the classroom, really helped them differentiate instruction. So your families are experts on their kids, and that's how they should be treated, and they should be listened to for that expertise. I hope that answers the question. Schwan, should I move on?
Yes, thank you, Dr.
Okay. So let's talk about a little bit about why it's been so difficult to sort of sustain and cultivate these partnerships between home and school. And, the pandemic has actually caused me to change what I say during this part of my presentation. I used to say that the main reason that partnerships are so difficult was because very few of us, and I want you all to think about this, very few of us have received training on how to do this. So whether we were, coming up in our pre-service program, even when we went on for maybe advanced degrees, our education community hasn't done such a good job in training us how to do this. And that's why these statewide family engagement centers are so fantastic, because that's what this is all about. You know, how do we make up for a lot that we didn't learn when we should have learned it, which was in our pre-service programs when we were getting our certification, et cetera, et cetera. So I used to say that that was the main reason that partnerships were not being cultivated and sustained. But I've had a chance to have some pretty provocative conversations with educators over the past 2 years. And what they've really revealed to me is that, you know, Dr. Mapp, if we really do a root cause analysis and we're really honest about why partnerships between home and school haven't flourished, it's because we as educators have not learned how valuable our families are. We just don't value our families, particularly our families who may be poor, or our families who speak different languages, or our families who have different backgrounds from us. And I really appreciated those conversations with educators because they were very honest conversations. And they said, yes, the training part is true, but if we really look under the hood and we really examine our core beliefs, we have to admit that in many cases, we really just have not learned to value our families. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And I was trying to figure out, well, what are the roots of that, right? Those core beliefs where maybe we have deficit-based mindsets about our families. And I started reading this wonderful book, and I don't know how many of you have read it. It's just beautifully written, by Isabel Wilkerson, called Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. And what she does is she talks about why it is that we may have some of the values and opinions about other people who are different from us. And so she talks about the caste system that we have it's built into the DNA of our country. And she says this: as we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats in a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality. It is about power, which groups have it and which do not. It's about resources, which caste is seen as worthy of them and which are not, who gets to acquire them and who does not. It is about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not? And so she says that, you know, these things, unfortunately, are in our systems, are in our structures. Some of you have probably read Beverly Tatum's work. She talks about the smog of the isms like racism, and I would extend that to sexism and classism. We breathe these things in, and consequently, even though we have good intentions, they come out in our practice. And this is how sort of the caste system shows up in our practice around family engagement. These are some of the things that I hear all the time. Again, from not people who are trying to be mean, not people who are well-intentioned, but it's in our systems that we kind of say these things about families. And so our families are sometimes stamped from the beginning with what I call the don't, can't, and won't assumptions. So a lot of times when I go and I do work in districts, I hear this: you know, Dr. Mapp, our families, the bottom line is they don't care. They don't care about their kids' education. You know, we're working around them and they don't care. They don't value education, Dr. Mapp, you know, and they can't be counted on to participate in things. They can't understand what we're asking. You know, many of them, you know, only graduated from maybe the 5th or 6th grade. So we can't expect them to understand what we're telling them. And they won't engage no matter what we do. And I'd like to say that I don't hear this very often but I'm sorry to say I hear it quite a bit. And again, it's from people who mean well. It's even from folks who say that they want to engage with families, right? But when we really start to push them on their practice, sometimes this is what I hear. And so, and I can't blame them, because our practices and our systems and our structures are many times set up to treat families as spectators, to keep them sort of outside and not as full team members and co-creators and designers. So how do we change? What's our way forward? And so this is a wonderful quote from a good friend of mine, Sonia Santelises. She is the current Chancellor CEO of the Baltimore Public Schools. And again, she's responding to what she has seen as a result of the two pandemics, particularly COVID. She says, you know, we have a choice about this crisis, people. As educators, we can make our new normal better than the old, engaging families as the partners that they are. Or we can wait for parents to lose whatever faith in us remains. They cannot unsee what they have witnessed so vividly in their own living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, right? Families were in there with us during COVID. And so there really isn't any turning back to say, okay, now we're going to go back to pushing you to the periphery. And thanks very much. We don't need to talk to you about teaching and learning anymore. No, parents want to stay in it. One of the things that we've learned, there was a survey that was done by them, a group called Mass Inc. here in Massachusetts. And they asked families, what is something that you like to keep that happened during the pandemic? Overwhelmingly, families said, we want to keep the partnership with our schools. We want to keep the partnership where we are talking about teaching and learning. The conversations switched from, you know, just about schedules and about discipline, which is unfortunately why a lot of phone calls were made home, to let's talk about our learning goals for the week. Let's talk about what it is that you can do at home to support the learning goals for the week. Parents want that to remain. They want that to stay. This is another quote by Nikki Barnes, who's an executive director of the KIP program here in Massachusetts. She again underscores what Dr. Santelises says. This past year, our families have become more than partners in our school. They have become co-authors of our educational journey. This is the new normal for our schools, and I am sure for so many others around the country. So again, we're hearing over and over about this new normal where families are co-creators, co-authors, co-teachers, co-learners. So in the Carnegie piece that I wrote with Ayal, I decided that I really wanted to punch this language around what the new normal of family engagement is, punch it up a bit to say, like, what do we really mean? What is the kind of partnership we really want to see between home and school? And so I said that, you know, the new normal of partnership, this co-design, co-educator, co-creator, is really about a liberatory practice around family engagement, where we're now free of dominance, free of hierarchy, where we really see our families as full partners. Solidarity driven, where the whole idea is that we are going to work in union and fellowship. And then, of course, equity focused. Family engagement, if it's done right, is an equity strategy. So equity focused, where our practice is fair and just. And so these are some of the things that we are learning from some of the early research that is coming out. When we see these partnerships that are liberatory, solidarity driven, and equity focused, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that these schools and classrooms really understand now that relationships matter. And the places who had this kind of partnership before the pandemic found that any kind of pivot that had to happen during COVID was easier, was much easier. Smoother transitions, less learning loss. People also now realize that families know more, can do more, and now we're giving them the credit that we weren't possibly giving them before the pandemic. And educators are now understanding that they need to learn more about how to do this. How do we really have these real true partnerships with our families? And so this is the dual capacity building framework for family school partnerships. I think this has been introduced to you already in the past, but I got phone calls in March of 2020 from people who said to me, Dr. Mapp, are you going to change the framework to meet the moment of the two pandemics or of the COVID pandemic? And I said, no, actually, it's the reverse, that now the moment is meeting the framework, because we had the essential conditions. We were telling people what effective partnerships had to look like, but a lot of people were hesitant. A lot of people were resistant. Now I think what we have in the framework makes sense to folks because they see it now as a true guide to effective partnerships. So we've had actually two versions of the framework. The first one was the one that I did work on with the USDOE that Schwan mentioned. The second one is the update that I put together because I'm really a person who's about continuous improvement. And so I was asking practitioners and parents and students and policymakers, what do you think I should add to this framework to make it even better? So in 2019, we launched the new version, which is the version you just saw. So here we are. This is a dual capacity framework, as I mentioned, and I'm going to go through some pieces of this quickly. First of all, the first section, and the framework is written, I should say, sort of like a logic model. So we start with, what's the challenge? Well, we've talked a little bit about that. And that is that as educators, a lot of us had not been exposed to strong examples of engagement. We had minimal training. And here's this mindset piece. We didn't see partnerships as really important. And maybe we have those deficit-based mindsets about families. On the family side, they haven't seen, in many cases, real strong examples of partnership either. And unfortunately, many have had pretty traumatic experiences with school themselves. One of my colleagues, Suhung, talks about generational disrespect that families have felt from schools. And they may not feel invited to their kids' schools. And again, they may feel disrespected, unvalued, and unheard. So what do we do about it? This is an article that I love. It's called The Water of Systems Change. It's actually written for foundations about how they should really see their funding. What are the things that they should really fund if they really want to see changes in the American educational system? But they really latch onto this idea about how we have to shift the conditions. Just shifting people's mindsets doesn't do anything, because if there's no structures and systems that have also been shifted to help them in their practice, then the practice will not be sustained. So the framework identifies what we call the essential conditions. These are the things that we really want you all to work on, to put into place in order to cultivate these effective practices that have an impact that we saw earlier on students and parents and educators in schools. So there's two sets of conditions. The first are process conditions, and these are ones that we really think that every single one of you can incorporate into your practice. And then the second is something we call the organizational conditions, and this is what your institutions have to put into place in order to support the work. We cannot expect to ask people to make these connections with families if we don't also have supports to help them when they make those connections. So for example, if we have teachers doing home visits and the family says, we really are facing food insecurity. Well, we don't want our teachers to have that put upon them and them having to run out and purchase food. We should have connections to community-based organizations so that the teacher can say, here's a card with some numbers on it of organizations that can help you, or we'll make the connection with that organization. But if those supports are not available, it makes it very hard to ask our educators to do this work and not providing with the supports. So in terms of the process conditions, the one that I really want to try to just focus on for today, just quickly, is the one about relationships. This is really where you have to start your work. And a lot of times this piece is skipped over. We have to develop what we call relational trust with our families. And relational trust, I talked about this yesterday. I actually spoke at the memorial service for Dick Robinson, who was the president of Scholastic, who passed away, unfortunately, very suddenly this summer. And I talked about how he was so good at this thing called relational trust. And that is really seeing that relationships are really the glue to everything else that we do. It's the foundation for all of our work, and specifically with our work with our families. But the elements of relational trust that we have to work on are respect, competence, integrity, and personal regard. And Ayal put together this little chart for himself to check himself about when he was working with families, because he was the family engagement director in El Cajon School District some years ago. And when he worked with his families and when he worked with his staff on what do you need to be thinking about when you're working with your families, he would say, if you're going to develop a relational trust, these are the 4 things you are going to have to think about. First of all, respect. And this goes to the question about listening. You and I both know that we feel respected when we feel listened to, when we feel seen, when we feel heard. And so one of the first things we have to think about is, how are our practices making sure that we embed an element of respectful listening with our families? So when you think back on your phone calls home, your parent-teacher conferences or your family conferences, are we listening to our families? Do we give them time to give us their input? Do we let them know that we value what they have to say? Number 2, competence. Am I demonstrating that I'm a competent practitioner to the families, but also am I letting them know that I feel that they're competent? Now, yes, some of our families are struggling with all sorts of things, but we have to start out with the mindset of seeing them as competent individuals. Many times they're trying the very best they can to support their children and their families. Integrity, making sure that we have a strong moral compass, but that we also keep our word. And then also personal regard, that we don't treat parents as a statistic or as one group, but we see them as people. This comes from Paulo Freire, that we really have personal regard for our families. I don't have time to go through the other pieces, but just quickly, we want to make sure that our practice is linked to learning. So as I said, families want to be in on the teaching and learning. They just don't want to hear about things that are superficial. We have to make sure our practice is asset-based. We see our families as having funds of knowledge, culturally responsive and respectful, collaborative. Again, that's that whole thing about solidarity driven, and then interactive, because when we look at the research on how human beings learn, we learn by doing. So you don't want to just give your families a piece of paper and say, go do this, right? We want to make sure there's opportunities for us to have fun and practice some of the strategies we'll want to learn to support children's learning. And I mentioned to you the organizational conditions. This is where your systems have to provide you with resources, and that could be time. Your superintendents or your district leaders need to talk about family engagement as one of those core ingredients. They need to see it as such. These are the things that are going to start happening. Remember those impacts on people that we talked about, on families, on educators? You're going to start to see these things happen, and we call them the 4 C's. So when we start to engage in these liberatory, solidarity-driven, and equity-focused partnerships, we are going to start to see that our educators and our families, they build their capabilities, what they know and are able to do to support kids. Our networks increase, right? We've got all these connections, either meeting new families, new educators, making these bonds. Our beliefs start to shift about one another. That's some of the work, the wonderful work Dr. Sheldon has done. And then confidence. We start to gain more confidence in being able to do this work well. Now we're working as partners. That's what this part of the framework tries to connote, with sort of a puzzle piece fitting together. We've got our educators and our families working together, and we're doing it all to support student learning, and school improvement. So what I want to do, because I know that we're getting short on time, I want to show you a video, and I want you to think about those process conditions, particularly the relational trust piece, the link to learning piece. I know you probably won't be able to hold them all in your head at the same time. If you want to take a look at the framework while you're watching the video, you can go to www.dualcapacity.org. It's a website that actually features the framework. And if you look at those process conditions, I want you to listen to this teacher. Her name is Annie. And I want you to listen for those process conditions. And what we'll do is after we watch the video, I don't think we have time for breakouts, but anybody could just write in the chat, what did you hear that is evidence of one of those process conditions and what Annie has to say. Annie, as a teacher, I certainly want to give you an opportunity to talk about, and you know, we usually have a lot of teachers on the call to talk about, you know, why are you so committed to engaging with families, and what do you get out of it? You know, sometimes we hear teachers say, you know, oh, this is one more thing to put on my plate. Oh, you know, this is going to be too much, and I'm already doing all these things already. We get a lot of that sometimes as pushback, and I totally get it because teachers are doing a lot. But why is this important to you? What does it offer you as a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many reasons that family engagement is important to me. And the first one is that families are the experts on their child. And I'm committed to knowing my students deeply. I'm committed to sparking their curiosity and having them be intellectually engaged. And partnerships with families, I believe, really make that possible. Families are what give us insight into a child's passions, into their strengths, into their areas of growth, and into like the social and emotional health of that child. So to me, that's baseline. Another reason family engagement is so important to me is because there's so much expertise among the families. So in a normal school year, I try to get as many experts into the classroom as possible. And as a teacher of Black and Brown students, I think it's really like vital for us to widen this idea of who the teacher is and who the experts are. And we need more people of color in front of our students. We need more men in front of our students. I teach at the elementary level. And so at the beginning of every year, I take an inventory and I ask families, like, what can you come in and teach us this year? What can you share with us? And you know, with the assumption that we're going to go partially remote or fully remote this year, I actually think that there are more opportunities than ever to bring those experts and all the families into our classroom space, because it's kind of easier in some ways right now. And then Karen, you asked, like, what does it do for me? And there certainly is a personal component to it. One of the things that I love about working with young people is it is authentic. Kids are real. So they don't hide their joys, they don't hide their frustrations, they don't hide their anger. And I like that. I like being in a real kind of raw space every day. And it feeds me to have those kind of intense relationships with kids. And I like having those relationships with families too. It honestly, it feeds me as a human to be able to interact with adults that way. And I think that when students and teachers and parents are in partnership and interacting authentically, students feel that viscerally. And it provides emotional support for them, and it provides like spiritual support as well. And I think that when we do that, and when our students witness that, we're saying to our students, we've got you, we love you, and you know, we're all on your team.
Annie, could you just say just a little bit, just one more thing I want to add in to follow up. So what would you say to teachers who are reticent about engaging with families? I mean, you said a lot about how it fills you up, right? You said it feeds me as a human. I love that. But are there a couple of other tidbits for those people who might still be a little hesitant about this that you can share?
Yeah, I think that in the long run, deep family relationships make the job easier and make the job more joyful. Teaching is so hard. It is so exhausting. And there is going to be a point in every school year where we're going to have some kind of difficult conversation with a parent. And when we have done the foundational work of building that relationship, those conversations are not difficult. You know, they're saying, hey, I'm concerned about this. Are you noticing this? Rather than making a phone call that I feel nervous about, that the parent doesn't want to receive. It's, to me, that work of building that relationship, that's like the first 2 months of school. And that first 2 months of school helps you for the rest of the school year. So to me, I just think it pays off so much to have those relationships from the beginning.
Okay, so in the chat, I'd love for you, and thank you for putting that question in. So I want you to answer that, or if anybody feels brave and just wants to chime in, what struck you about what Annie said? And did you hear her talking about, or did you see, and even the way she talked about, any of the process conditions in that short clip? So either be brave and just unmute, or you can put it in the chat.
Dr. Mapp?
Yes.
Yeah, so I loved her energy and her excitement, and you can really see that she has that passion to establish relationships, really, you know, with not only the students, but their families. I mean, the fact that she does that inventory, you know, really bridges that relationships with her students, but just, you know, checking with the families, acknowledging that they have this wealth of knowledge about their child. So I thought that was very, very nice and warm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, Dr. Matt, the chats are coming. It's actually from our Q&A to everyone, because the chat actually directed it to Q&A, and she'll type it out.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm starting to see them come in now.
Mhm.
So it brings everybody together. That's absolutely true. And even, you know, one of the things that I do want to point out is that, you know, our families in many cases are coming from difficult circumstances, right? But I have found that even in those circumstances, when we build those relationships, if we really take the time to work on that relational trust, what we find is that, you know, those families end up being so grateful for the kind of connection that we want to make with them, that they then, you know, go the extra mile. I'll tell you a quick story about that. So there's a school that I work with in Rhode Island called the Learning Community, and their whole reason for being is around family engagement. It's built into the foundation of the school. And they serve a community where 100% of the students qualify for free or reduced lunch. The community is, there's quite a bit of, they sort of say that they're ground zero for drug and alcohol abuse in the community. It also serves a very large undocumented community of families. But they just have this whole approach to family engagement. To work there, you have to have particular core beliefs around family engagement, as evidenced by work you've done in the past. And when COVID hit, and I'm going to underscore that all of these families qualify for free reduced price lunch. When COVID hit, and families got their first checks, relief checks from the federal government, they called one of the co-directors at the school and said, you know, we know there are other families in the community that have less than we do. So can we donate our checks to the school and set up a fund for those families? Can we come to the school and do food drives at the school? Because we know that there are other families who need it more than we do. I mean, that's the kind of culture they've set up at this place. So they don't see anybody as sort of a broken family or thing. They just know that we're all in this together. We've got to show that we love each other. And for that reason, their school performs as well as the suburban better resources schools in the state of Rhode Island. Their test scores, their kids' grades are at or above those other schools in better resource communities. The resource that they use is love and trust. And it's not to say that they don't need the other resources. So let's be clear, I'm not going to say that's a replacement for having the funding. You have to have that. But they are willing to do so much more. They leverage that because of the trusting relationships they have with their parents. So if someone says deep relationships make the job easier, okay, it's evident that she's passionate about her opportunity and responsibility to work with children and families. She wants to be there and she wants to engage families for the betterment of everybody's learning. So thank you so much for your feedback. So I'm going to open this up now for a full Q&A because I know that we're a little behind schedule. And Schwan, how many, can we take a few questions?
Right now, we're good. We don't have many questions now.
Okay, well, this is the time. People, don't hold back and don't hesitate to ask questions. This was a lot. I think if I'm going to have you take away one thing that I want you to think about is one, where does family engagement situate itself in your own practice and in the practice of your school or your organization? You have to elevate it in your own practice. I want you all to leave this understanding that family engagement is a core part of your practice. And guess what? My friend, and we have this in the Carnegie article, my friend Michelle Brooks always says family engagement is not a program. Family engagement is a practice. It's a part of your practice. You really cannot see yourself as proficient as an educator unless you build your practice around family engagement. And so that's the kinds of supports the Family Engagement Center can provide you, okay? That's what we're working towards. We want you to build your capacity to be like Annie so that you can incorporate this family engagement into your work because you're gonna really see gains. I mean, I know you're all looking for like, what are some of the strategies we can use given what we've gone through the last 18 months to bring our kids back up to speed? Well, engaging with your families is going to be a core and important strategy for you to do that. But start with, again, your mindset around it. And then the first thing you want to do is every activity, every event that you already have scheduled with your families, you need to build in some trust building activities into that. Start with building trust, listening to your families, telling them how important they are to you, you know, how this is a partnership. What are your child's hopes and dreams? Okay. I think Dr. Sheldon's going to follow up with some other good information on what to do, but that's where you need to start.
Yeah, but in the chat, we have a comment, which I'm going to read. Sometimes transparency is key to engaging with families, not just parents with school, but also school with families. Many times school administration / staff use state administration rules as an excuse to what they do instead of having a conversation with families to find out what the family dynamics are.
Well, this is where all of us, myself, I know Schwan and Lisa included, we're working on some of these. Remember I talked about the systems and structures also have to change. These are the kinds of things that we're all working on. And what we're hoping is for some of you who may decide that you are, you know, I'm sure there's some school leaders in the audience. This is where we have to kind of use our voice to try to say, what would be systems and structures that would be better aligned to the kind of liberatory practice we want in terms of family engagement? What are some of the changes that we might be able to make? Maybe, changes with, do we provide time for our educators to actually reach out to families? So let's look at our rules and regulations, and maybe we can move some things around so that we can show our educators that this is important to us because we've made these changes, right? So these are some of the things that also have to be done. And then overcoming these issues about, teachers don't understand about the cultural competence piece. Well, that's where a lot of the work that I'm sure is happening in Hawaii and other places around cultural competency and really learning about families, their backgrounds, their cultures. Very, very, very important. That's all a part of this. We're all continuous learners. I'm learning every day. My students bring something to me new every day. Sometimes, it's hard for me because I've got old habits and bad habits in some cases, but I say, okay, I'm open. That's the other thing. We have to have an open mind. I'm open to learning new things. Anything else?
I think we're good now.
There's another question in the chat box.
Often when someone says the parents don't care, it is because they don't understand the community or there is mistrust in the community. How would you say we can overcome these issues as teachers? How can we hold other staff accountable when we hear these attitudes expressed?
Well, one of the things I think we do have to do is, is to say, I haven't had that experience. My experience has been, and I often say this, that when I've been doing this work now for 25 years almost, and I've never met a parent who doesn't care. I've met parents who were afraid. I've met parents who had felt disrespected. I have met parents that are going through a lot in their lives so that those obstacles make it look like they don't care. But when I really talk to them and ask them about their hopes and dreams for their child, it's pretty clear to me that they do care about their child and want the best for them. And that's why they send them to school, because they're expecting that their child hopefully will get some information and learn some things that'll help them be better off. I've had parents say to me, please, miss, help me so that my child doesn't turn out like me. I've had parents say that to me. So I think we have to understand that if you start with a mindset that parents don't care, your actions and your behaviors are going to follow that mindset. And your families will see it. And then guess what? You won't see them again because they can feel, even with the tone of voice, with the way you look at them, that you have a deficit-based model thinking about them, and they won't come back because they feel the disrespect. Okay. So I think that things like relational home visits helps this. Steve, I don't know if you're going to be talking about, what we've learned from the research about when we do the kind of relational home visits that the parent-teacher home visit program suggests, that changes some of these biases that we may have about each other because we're talking to each other as people. And so I think if we always start with the academic stuff and all of the heavy stuff that maybe our parents don't understand and haven't been exposed to, that puts us on an unequal playing field. Whereas if we really talk about just ourselves and get to know each other as people, I think a lot of those biases start to disintegrate. So even with, it says, any thoughts when parents, families start to feel overconfident and entitled and start to delve into things that might be non-negotiables like school colors, offering events outside of school. See, I think that this is where we go sort of off the rails when even in communities of privileged families, the relational trust thing still holds. If we start with that and we really get our families to understand our goals and get them to share their goals around the students, around student learning and development, then we sort of don't get sidetracked as much with some of the other stuff that isn't as important. I realize that right now is a tough time because unfortunately, I think COVID has really highlighted a lot of the distrust between home and school. And so we have a lot of systems that are dealing with these issues around distrust. But I know it's going to be hard, but I think we have to really sort of give it some time. But I think if we're transparent, that's that word that was used by somebody else, and we let families know that really what we need to focus on is trying to make sure that, you know, our kids make up for whatever learning loss they may have experienced, and that we don't get sidetracked in some of these other things, and we show families our goals. Because think about it, a lot of times we don't share with our families what our goals are around teaching and learning.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mapp, for sharing your knowledge and, you know, all these like inspiring message. I think we're going to go into the break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for Dr. Stephen Sheldon.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mapp. Thank you, Chuan. Have a wonderful break.
Thanks, everybody.
Dr. Mapp, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.